Okay, as I was saying, um, we're going back 120 years, and it's the Niagara Movement. This is actually Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and it is the beginning. It wasn't the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People yet, but this is the foundation as African Americans, or some African American leaders decide, hey, you know what we want to do? We want equal rights in the United States, and the Niagara Movement starts. Why do they want equal rights? Well, lynching is a way of life in America. Theodore Roosevelt starts his second term. And farming is, all of a sudden, farmers don't want to be on farms anymore. They're living, or they want to go to the big city where there's things like electricity. Things like the subway. The other day on October 27th, it was the 120th anniversary of the opening of the New York City subway system, the 4 line, which went basically from the Brooklyn Bridge up to about 145th Street. Child labor was a thing in 1905. And take a look at these kids. They're working in the mines. There was a war, the Russian-Japanese War. And there was a Russian Revolution, and this is Georgy Gapon, one of the leaders of the movement. Football is a deadly game, and remains a deadly game. In 2024, there have been at least a dozen football players who've been killed on the field or from football-related injuries. That was through September. 1905, 18 on football death roll. In the season of 1905, 10 high school players dead as a result of hurts on the gridiron, college players killed. Number 4, one girl on the list. There was one girl who played football who was killed. There was a baseball betting scandal with John J. McGraw, who was the manager of the New York Giants. And there were movies. You could go see a movie for a nickel. The horse, the runaway horse, and the haunted house, a laughing success, all for a nickel back in those days. How many of you like Sherlock Holmes? You like Sherlock Holmes? Well, he makes a comeback in 1905. And Viva Las Vegas! How many of you been to Las Vegas? Do you like it?
It depends what you're going for.
Depends what you're going for. Well, you know, my wife is hanging out with fake Elvis there in that picture. But in 1905, Las Vegas became a city. But probably the most important aspect of 1905 was this thing called the Niagara Movement. And again, this is Great Barrington up in Massachusetts, and W.E.B. Du Bois. He is the leader of the Niagara Movement, and would be one of the major civil rights leaders of the 20th century. 40 years after the South's defeat in the Civil War in 1865, the outlook for civil rights for African Americans was bleak. America clung to its racist past, according to black intellectuals. Didn't seem that President William McKinley or President Theodore Roosevelt were too concerned with racial relations. Reconstruction had failed by the mid-1870s, and Jim Crow laws were enacted in the South. The Supreme Court of the United States, 1896, separate but equal doctrine, Plessy v. Ferguson, coupled with Booker T. Washington's accommodation policies, threatened to cloud any hope for full and equal rights under the law. Booker T. Washington actually was the first African American to officially visit the White House. Theodore Roosevelt had him come in to talk to him in 1901 about racial relationships. He was one of the era's most influential black leaders and argued that black people should advance themselves through learning skills such as farming, carpentry, rather than look to legal and political means to advance as a group. We shall not agitate for political or social equality, Washington declared in 1895 in a speech known as the Atlantic Compromise. Living separately yet working together, both races will determine the future of our beloved South. Plessy versus Ferguson, that was a landmark 1896 Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitution of racial segregation under separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which African-American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for black people. Does that sound familiar, like Rosa Parks? Way ahead of time, like in 1955. Well, that was the first protest. I'm not sitting, I'm basically not going to sit in a car for black people. There are no known pictures of Homer Plessy, but there is a marker talking about that Supreme Court decision. White-black Southerners mixed relatively freely until the 1880s when state legislators passed the first laws requiring railroads to provide separate cars for Negro or colored passengers. Florida became the first state to mandate segregated railroad cars in 1887, followed in quick succession by Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and other states by the end of the 19th century. Members of the black community in New Orleans decided to mount a resistance after the Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890 was passed. At the heart of the case that became Plessy versus Ferguson was a law passed in Louisiana in 1890, providing for separate railway carriages for white and colored races. It stipulated that all passenger railways had to provide these separate cars, which should be equal in facilities. And these are the cars back in those days. This doesn't look too comfortable for anybody, but those were the railroad cars. The Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890. Homer Adolph Plessy agreed to be the plaintiff in the case, aimed at testing the law's constitutionality, and he was of mixed race. He described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood. On June 7, 1892, Plessy bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans bound for Covington, Louisiana, took a vacant seat in the whites-only car. After refusing to leave the car at the conductor's insistence, he was arrested and jailed. Convicted by a New Orleans court of violating the 1890 law, Plessy filed a petition against the presiding judge, John H. Ferguson, claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Over the next few years, segregation and black disenfranchisement picked up pace in the South and was more tolerated by the North. Congress defeated a bill that would have given federal protection to elections in 1892 and nullified a number of Reconstruction laws on the books. This is Justice Henry Brown, Harvard-trained lawyer. He's on the Supreme Court. He writes the opinion that, we could give Negroes, colored people, good stuff, but they can't mix with the whites. On May 18, 1869, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Plessy versus Ferguson. In declaring separate but equal facilities constitutional on interstate railroads, the court ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment apply only to political and civil rights like voting and jury service. By the way, in the 19th century, women could not serve on the jury. Maybe I should have said that Monday when I didn't want to serve on the jury. Hey, never mind. Anyway, sitting in the railroad car of your choice, not social rights. The court denied that segregated railroad cars for black people were necessarily inferior. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument, the justice, the Harvard-trained lawyer, Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that enforced separation of the two races stamped the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that the law implies merely a legal distinction between white and black people, not unconstitutional. As a result, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace. This is the Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he did not agree. And he once was a slave owner from Kentucky. He had opposed the Emancipation, 1863, and civil rights for freed slaves during the Reconstruction era, but changed his position due to his outrage over the action of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Harlan argued in his dissent that the segregation law ran counter to the constitutional principle of equality under the law. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race, while they are on public highway, is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. There would be more, such as Cummings versus Board of Education, separate but equal. Colored people could go to schools without whites as long as those schools were equal in facility to a white school, which we know really didn't happen until the 1960s. That is the background for the Niagara movement. The Plessy versus Ferguson verdict enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal as a constitutional justification for segregation, ensuring the survival of the Jim Crow South. Intrastate railroads were among many segregated public facilities the verdict sanctioned. Other areas included buses and theaters and swimming pools and schools. I knew a guy who was telling me, he's a year older than me, African American from Salem, Virginia, that when he was little, 5, 6 years old, around 1961, 1962, he had to sit in the upper section of the movies. This is in the early 1960s. And he once asked, well, why can't I sit with everybody else? And I said, because I'm not going to use the word that he was told, but he had to sit upstairs. He said he was crying. I said, well, why can't I sit downstairs? He's 5 years old. By the time of the 1899 case, Cummings versus the Board of Education, even Harlan agreed that 2 segregated public schools, and that didn't violate the Constitution. Now, this brings in Theodore Roosevelt. Was Theodore Roosevelt a racist? Was he a eugenicist? Well, the evidence is kind of murky on the racist thing. Eugenics, no, he was a eugenicist. On September 14, 1901, Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States following the assassination of William McKinley. He had been Vice President for only 194 days when he succeeded to the presidency. But he did not see all black Americans as equal. He believed that black men made poor soldiers. He denigrated the efforts of the Buffalo Soldiers who fought alongside his men at San Juan Hill in Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898, falsely claiming that they ran when they were under fire. He said Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go as far as they were led by white officers. But he brings Booker T. Washington into the White House, Booker T. and the TRs, and this cartoon, Equality. Roosevelt thought African Americans were inferior to white citizens, although he did get Booker T. Washington to dine in the White House on October 16, 1901. While the governor of New York, a distinguished colored singer, was denied in Albany, New York, in one of the hotels, the circumstance having reaching Roosevelt in person, and he invited the citizen to his residence where he gave him lodging. Well, there's that. However, and he also, when he assumed office as vice president, his first act was to appoint a colored man as an executive messenger against the protest of certain officials. Again, he meets with Booker T. Washington, but after he meets with Booker T. Washington, he would never again invite an African American to the White House. So what was he? Was he a racist? Hard to tell. We know he was a eugenicist. But here's another example of maybe racism. His racial philosophy of white superiority dovetailed with his support of the eugenics movement, which advocated selective breeding to engineer a race of people with more desirable characteristics and the sterilization of less desirable people, such as criminals, people with development disabilities, and for some, their color. So what is he? He shared similar views on race with prominent figures such as Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and John D. Rockefeller, who had all the money in the world because of oil, and an English politician by the name of Winston Churchill. All of them supported the eugenics movement. Roosevelt's approach to racial issues was to proceed slowly toward the goal of social and economic equality. He cautioned against imposing radical changes in government policy, favoring, hopefully, gradual adjustments in the attitudes of white Americans toward ethnic minorities. Well, this was also a time when lynching literally was an event. Take a look at that crowd, and this is a lynching taking place. And they are there to watch the lynching. I've always said about Americans that if you had a pay-per-view and you were executing somebody for a crime, you would get 2 or 3 million people buying the event, $39.95 per shot. Make a lot of money because Americans would watch. They would watch an electrocution of somebody. Lynching was an event. During the 1880s and 1890s, instances of lethal mob violence increased steadily, peaking in 1899 when 27 Georgians fell victim to lynch mobs. Between 1890 and 1900, Georgia averaged more than 1 mob killing a month. Georgia was not the only state where lynchings occurred. Mississippi was the nation's top spot for lynchings. Lynching victims were murdered by being hanged, shot, burned, drowned, dismembered, or dragged to death. In May 1905, a storekeeper by the name of F.M. Holbrook and his wife were murdered in Oconee County, Georgia. In the aftermath, 1 white man and 3 African-American men were arrested, with the white man accused of the murder and the 3 African-American men accused of being accomplices to the murder. They were held in jail along with 6 others, all African-Americans, for various reasons. Watkinsville, Georgia lynching. Mob lynches 7 Negroes and a white man. It is midnight, June 29th. A large mob of individuals, reportedly from nearby Morgan County, Georgia, organized travel to Oconee County at 2 a.m. on June 30th, 1905. The large mob of between 50 and 100 people broke into the county jail. And more on the lynching. So these guys are just citizens. They break into the jail. Well, there's a long history of this. I had a guy I knew by the name of Fred, who was with United Press back in the late 50s, early 60s, and he was covering the civil rights movement in the South. And he said the cops were in on all this. Cops were KKK members. The cops were all in all the shenanigans going on in the late 1950s. Fred had to leave the South. UP pulled him out of there because his life was in danger. He said nothing had changed. The mob went to the house of the town marshal, compelled him to take them to the county jail, where the jailer relinquished the keys to the jail cells at gunpoint. Afterwards, they seized 9 of 10 prisoners, including the murder suspect, proceeded to tie them to nearby fence posts. 1 prisoner apparently had avoided the attention of the mob, was left in his cell. Of the 9 men seized by the mob, only 1 had been convicted of the crime, while the others were awaiting trial. After tying the men to the post, they proceeded to open fire on the men, with the New York Tribune reporting that 5 volleys were fired at the men. 8 of the men died because of the gunfire, while 1 man survived, proceeded to play dead. Following the lynching, several of the bodies were buried in the same grave. Very, very few people were ever arrested following a lynching. Why? Cops were involved. So that brings us to the Niagara Movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, running for New York Senate in 1950s, one of the posters there. Great Negro, great American U.S. Senator, vote C, November 7th, American Labor Party for W.E.B. Du Bois. He drafted a call to a select people. The call had two purposes: organized demonstration and aggressive action on the part of men who believed in Negro freedom and growth in opposition to present methods of strangling honest criticism. He gathered a group of men representing every region of the United States except for the West. Now, the story gets a little murky here. They were supposed to meet in Buffalo. They were refused accommodation. One story is they were all blacks, so the hotel didn't want them. The other story in Buffalo is that there was no room at the hotel for them. So they went up to the fun side of Niagara Falls, Ontario. They got the casinos and everything else on that side. They don't have much on the American side. Anyway, so they go across the border and they meet at the Erie Beach Hotel in Ontario, July 11th through the 14th. This is the Niagara Movement, and this would be the predecessor to the NAACP. The Niagarites adopted the Constitution and bylaws, established committees, and wrote a Declaration of Principles outlining the future for African Americans. After 3 days, they went across the border with a renewed sense of resolve in the struggle for freedom and equality. After their initial meeting, the founding members of the Niagara Movement adopted the Constitution and bylaws and drafted a Declaration of Principles that dedicated the group to fighting for political and social equality for African Americans. But Teddy Roosevelt's second term begins on March the 4th, 1905. The election was held on November 8th, 1904, and Roosevelt easily defeated the Democrat Alton B. Parker. Roosevelt's win marked the first time that the president, not originally elected to office, succeeded in retaining the presidency. On election day, it was a landslide victory. He got 336 electoral votes, Parker just 140. The popular margin, Roosevelt got 56.4% of the vote, Parker 37.6%, and the socialist candidate, Eugene V. Debs, got about 400,000 votes. His second term begins, and this is what he's talking about. Good relations with the world, that's important, but relations among Americans is the most important. He admitted that the founding fathers could not foresee certain problems that plagued the nation, but assures that these problems, they're problems that all great nations face. He recognized that the industrial age made it difficult for Americans to adapt to the complexities of the modern age. And if you think of it, you're on a farm somewhere, you move to New York City, there's a subway, there's electricity in the streets, and you're back with your lamps back at the farm. Not even at the farm. Of course, New York City wasn't all that well developed either in 1905. Roosevelt did recognize this, but assured Americans that the technology innovations brought tremendous change in American life. I think it did. Speak softly, carry a big stick. In annual messages to Congress in 1904 and 1905, Roosevelt explained that the Monroe Doctrine expanded the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt stated that not only were the nations of the Western Hemisphere not open to colonization by European powers, except if the Americans were doing it, but the United States had the responsibility to preserve order, protect life and property in those countries, like they were doing at that time or just finished doing in Cuba and Puerto Rico. European intervention in Latin America countries resurfaced as an issue in the United States foreign policy when European governments began to use force to pressure several Latin American countries to repay their debt. British, German, and Italian gunboats blocked Venezuelan ports in 1902 when the Venezuelan government defaulted on its debt. to foreign bondholders. Many Americans worried that European intervention in Latin America would undermine their country's traditional dominance in the region. Roosevelt tied his policy to the Monroe Doctrine. It was also consistent with his foreign policy of walk softly, but carry a big stick. Roosevelt stated that in keeping with the Monroe Doctrine, the United States was justified in exercising international police power to put an end to chronic unrest or wrongdoing in the Western Hemisphere. Well, the Monroe Doctrine was signed or was explained by the President James Monroe in 1823. Monroe made 4 basic points. The United States would not interfere in European affairs. The United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies in the Americas. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization unless it was done by the Americans. If a European power tried to interfere with any nation in the Americas, it would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. That's a sweatshop. I don't think my family was involved in a sweatshop. I don't think my family was. They may have run one eventually, but anyway, that is an American sweatshop. Mass migration of people into the cities from farms enriched some people, but caused several problems for others. Jobs in factories were considered better than domestic service, and department store jobs were considered even better than factory jobs. Clerical work was open to women. They were allowed to work. That's nice. And was considered more prestigious than some other jobs. African Americans had limited work opportunities, and most worked in labor or service jobs. Many immigrants resented or faced resentment in low wages. About a third of the immigrants who came over went back. Only 2/3 stayed. And by the way, let me explain a little bit about immigration. There was no such thing as undocumented, no such thing as illegal. That comes way later. If the United States had a trade treaty or just a treaty with another country, immigrants could come over without a problem. They weren't checked out if all that was needed was a treaty or a trade agreement. Thousands of immigrants crowded into cities seeking a better life. Less than 8% of the American homes had electricity. Most American women could not vote, and it seemed the women's suffrage movement had stalled. The rapid, unregulated urbanization led to overcrowding and substandard housing. Cities lacked adequate infrastructure, including water and sewer systems. Tenements were cheap, low-rise apartment buildings that were often cramped, poorly lit, lacked indoor plumbing, improper ventilation. The lack of clean water and inadequate sanitation made workers and their families vulnerable to infectious diseases like tuberculosis. This is Christmas Day on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and just everybody's crowded together. That was American life in those days. For many of the urban poor living in the city and the decreased quality of life, there were few city services that they could rely upon. The working class lived daily with overcrowding, inadequate water facilities, unpaved streets, and disease. Working class wages provided little more than a subsistence living and few, if any, opportunities for movement out of the city slums. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan until I was 8 years old, and I always heard this, oh, they live in the Bronx. They have money. They live in the Bronx. Well, they didn't live on the Grand Concourse. They lived over in Tremont Avenue in those places. You were laughing at that. Why were you laughing at that?
The difference.
The difference?
Between today and
Oh, today and then? Yeah.
the
So,
Bronx.
in the Bronx. Anyway, child labor. About 8 years old, this kid's working. There was an estimated 2 million children under the age of 16 working around the United States. The children varied in age from 6 and 7 years old in the cotton mills in Georgia, 8, 9, and 10 years old in the coal breakers of Pennsylvania, to 14, 15, and 16 years in other states. In Alabama, a law stated that a child under the age of 16 could not work in a cotton mill any longer than 8 hours a day. North and South Carolina and Georgia had no restriction upon the work of children at night. In New Jersey, boys and girls after their 14th birthday could work all night long. In North Carolina, a bill was proposed to raise the minimum working age of children from 12 to 14 and prohibit night work for children under 14. However, the Cotton Manufacturers Association president declared that if a minimum age law passed specifying 13 and 14, or rather 14 as a minimum age, every mill in the state would close. After an organized campaign of opposition, the measure failed to receive one single vote in the North Carolina legislature. But if you had money, well, Manhattan was your oyster if you had money. For the emerging middle class, benefiting from growing incomes and increases in leisure time, the expanded city offered many advantages. You go to clothing stores, department stores, chain stores, and I'm not sure how much of a chain store there was. I mean, maybe S. Klein, I think he only had one store on 14th Street. And shopping centers all emerged to meet the growing demand for material goods. Parks, amusement parks, and baseball stadiums were built to meet aesthetic and recreational needs. Transportation systems improved, as did the general infrastructure, better meeting the increased needs of the middle class and the upper class city dwellers. This is city life. This is when you went to the local market to buy something, whatever food you needed. The literacy rate in the United States was 106.6 per every 1,000 people, or per 1,000 persons. Statistics showed that 6,180,063 people were illiterate in the United States. The Arizona Republic, and Arizona wasn't a state yet, it was just a territory, observed literacy. Illiteracy is more common in the country than in the city. This is due to the superior schools in towns and the more general attendance of children. Arizona was not a state. There were about 158,000 people living in the Arizona territory. There were about 84 million Americans. There were 45 states. America had territories in Alaska and Arizona and Guam, in Hawaii, in New Mexico, Oklahoma, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Theodore Roosevelt was also making America into a superpower diplomatically, and offered to intervene in the Russian-Japanese conflict, seeking to end that war through negotiations. The Russo-Japanese War. 1904, the Russian Empire, ruled by Nicholas II, was one of the largest territorial powers in the world. However, with the Siberian shipping center, Vladivostok, forced to close during the winter because of ice, the empire needed a warm water Pacific Ocean port for the purposes of trade, as well as a base for its navy. Tsar Nicholas II had his sights set on the Korean Peninsula and the Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese were concerned about Russian influence in the region since the first Sino-Chinese-Japanese War of 1895. Japanese opted to go to war. They had an attack, which was a surprise attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur, February 8, 1904. The military costs were high for both countries, with mass casualties. The Japanese asked Theodore Roosevelt to negotiate a peace agreement, and representatives of the two countries met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. For the sake of maintaining the balance of power and economic opportunities in the region, Roosevelt preferred that the war end on terms that left both Russia and Japan a role to play in northeast China. Though excited by the Japanese military victories, Roosevelt worried about the consequences to American interests if Japan managed to drive Russia out immediately and entirely. And there's the negotiations back then. Because neither nation was in a strong financial position to continue the war that easily, both were forced to compromise in terms of the peace. The Roosevelt-initiated treaty ultimately gave Japan control of Korea and much of southern Manchuria, including including Port Arthur and the railway that connected it with the rest of the region, along with the southern half of the Sakhalin Islands. Russia's power was curtailed in the region, but they didn't have to pay for anything in terms of Japan and their war costs. The Japanese public felt they won the war, so why should they pay? But they considered the lack of indemnity to be an affront. The Russian people were also dissatisfied, angry about giving up half of the Sakhalin. The actual importance of Roosevelt's mediation and personal pressure on the leadership in Moscow and Tokyo to the final agreement is unclear, but the war ended. Russia was an absolutely miserable place. And some of my ancestors came from Russia. Anybody have ancestors who came from Russia? You did. They ever talk about it?
Okay.
No, it's a miserable. One of my relatives said that they had 6 flags around, and every day they'd put up a flag trying to figure out if it was the Tsarist country or it was something else at that time, because the borders were always changing. The Russian Revolution of 1905, known as the First Russian Revolution, began January 22nd. A wave of mass political and social unrest then began to spread across the various areas of the Russian Empire. The arrest was directly, primarily against the Tsar Nicholas II, the nobility, and the ruling class. It included worker strikes, peasant unrest, and military routines and mutinies. On January 6th, that's the Julian calendar. Today, January 22nd, they changed the calendar to the 19-teens. Violence erupted in St. Petersburg, Russia, when unarmed demonstrators led by Father Georgy Gapon, fired upon by soldiers of the Imperial Guard as they marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The events in St. Petersburg, on what was referred to as Bloody Saturday, provoked public outrage. Miserable place was Russia, and there's a cartoon of Bloody Sunday. Newly emancipated peasants earned too little and were not allowed to sell or mortgage their allotted land. Ethnic and national minorities resented the policy of Russification of the empire. This was caused by discrimination and repression against national minorities like the Jews and the Poles, and included bans on voting and serving in the Imperial Guard or Navy, and limiting their attendance in schools. Soldiers returning from a bloody and disgraceful defeat with Japan found inadequate factory pay, shortages, general disarray, and organized in protest. Nicholas II attempted to appease the people with the Duma. However, the autocrats eventually resorted to brute force near the end of the year in order to curtail the burgeoning strike movement that continued to spread. The Tsar had been seen as champion of the people, but that all changes after Bloody Sunday. So college football. Anybody follow college football here? No? No? It's a big issue. Not like it is today with the betting and the drinking and all of that stuff and the players getting paid or not. Big issue is people are getting killed playing football. People are getting killed. And the newspapers the cartoonists are noticing this, and they're doing cartoons about dead football players. 40 players between 1904 and 1905 were killed on the gridiron. Theodore Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer after reported 40 players died from injuries suffered on the field over a 2-year period in 1904 and in 1905. Roosevelt said, "I believe in outdoor games, and I do not mind in the least that they are rough games or that those who take part in them are occasionally injured." But it was more than injuries. So could Roosevelt actually ban football? The answer is no. There's no way he could do it. People are going to play, and especially in the coal mine. I mean, You go to outside the coal mines in western Pennsylvania and say you can't play? Well, anyway. So he does threaten to ban the game. The November 1905 death of the Union College halfback Harold Moore, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage after being kicked in the head while trying to tackle a New York University player, became a major newspaper story. A cartoon in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune showed the Grim Reaper atop the goalpost. Theodore Roosevelt brought the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton into the Oval Office, told them, fix the game or else. But Roosevelt had some problems even with this ban, and I'm going to explain the problems he had. They were all personal. He hated the Harvard president, Charles Eliot. The Harvard contingent wanted to change football. Walter Camp, who came up with the first rules of football in 1876, the coach at Yale, wanted to keep it as is. This is one of the cartoons. Skull and crossbones, the shawl with death written on it, and behind this guy, dead football players in the football that looked like a watermelon because it was a watermelon size in those days. No one could actually figure out how Roosevelt could end the game because he couldn't, but the threat of a ban was enough to get changes in playing rules to make the game safer. The Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. This is 1904 action. Big crowd watching the game. Columbia, Duke, and Northwestern suspended their football programs. The Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, said he would make an example of any West Point cadet who plays rough football and have him dismissed if necessary. I don't think that would happen today, particularly with West Point being 7-0 at this point, having their best season in years. This is Charles Eliot. Charles Eliot hated Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, Harvard man himself, hated Charles Eliot. According to the New York Times, Harvard President Charles Eliot said that football was more brutalizing than prize fighting, cockfighting, or bullfighting. I demand that football change its rules or be abolished, change the game or forsake it. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. suffered major injuries in high school and in college. But that was one. He hated Eliot. This is another one, the Rough Riders. And you're going to say probably, what do the Rough Riders have to do with college football and Roosevelt threatening to ban football? Actually, a lot. He had a soft spot for the game. Why? 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, gave their occupations as football players when they enlisted in 1898. The college presidents needed a solution and began working on a plan. And they eventually would have one in place by 1906. Now, Pete Rose just died. Well, he died a month ago or so. But before there was Pete Rose betting on baseball on his own team, there was the New York Giants manager, John McGraw. He bet on his own team. He is in baseball's Hall of Fame. Pete Rose, the only way he could get to Baseball Hall of Fame, or the Baseball Hall of Fame in his day, was to pay to get in there, although some of his memorabilia is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, which makes absolutely no sense. You're not giving him a plaque, but you're showing off some of his memorabilia. It's another story for another day. John J. McGraw in the World Series betting scandal. John McGraw was the manager of the National League's New York Giants, and he wins $400 betting on his team to win the World Series. That would be about $14,000 today. Now, he did the same exact thing that Pete Rose did, but he got away with it. McGraw held his team out of the 1904 series against Boston because he had a grudge against the American League president, Van Johnson, who suspended McGraw for his boorish on-field behavior during McGraw's tenure as an American League manager in Baltimore in 1901. Led by Christy Mathewson's 3 shutouts thrown in the span of 6 days, the New York Giants beat the Philadelphia A's in 5 games, and neither one of those teams exists anymore. And McGraw got his money and his revenge on Johnson. There were rumors that gamblers had gotten to Philadelphia's star pitcher Rube Waddell and paid him to sit out the World Series. He did pitch. He performed poorly because of a shoulder injury. McGraw won the bet and let the public know about it. He was not thrown out of baseball because of betting. He was boasting about it. The movies. Nickelodeon. That is a Nickelodeon from 1905. On May 28th, the Warner Brothers, Harry, Sam, and Albert opened up the Cascade Movie Palace in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. It seated 99 people, and there's a purpose for that. Patrons could watch 3 movies for a nickel, which would be about $1.79 today. Now, why was it just 99? Well, you could get around all kind of laws if it's under 100. No safety regulations. You didn't have fire extinguishers in there or have emergency exits. This is a slide from a 1937 Warner Brothers cartoon where they play the song Acrobat's Daughter, and all of a sudden the people who are following the bouncing ball, people being the animated people in the cartoon, all of a sudden, after they're saying, you know, here's an acrobat's daughter, all that other stuff, please do not spit on the floor. That was an inside joke at Warner Brothers in 1937. Because in 1905, before the film started, Sam Warner opened the show with some informative slides for his audience. The first stated, please read the titles to yourself. Loud reading annoys your neighbors. This was followed by, ladies, kindly remove your hats, and gentlemen, please do not spit on the floor. When the first reel of the film ended, a slide appeared reading, one moment please while the operators change reels. On June 19, Harry Davis and John Harris opened their first movie theater, calling it a Nickelodeon in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh without an H. They got their H back around 1911 or somewhere around there, and they're the only city that ends B-U-R-G-H in the United States, thanks to some picayune law. Anyway, Pittsburgh. The opening featured the 1903 film, The Great Train Robbery. The name Nickelodeon was derived from the cost of admission, a nickel, $1.79 today, and the Greek word for theater, Odeon. Rescued by Rover was the most popular movie in those days. Rescued by Rover, star was Rover, a shepherd dog who leads his master to a kidnapped baby. The film followed creative cutting and energetic traveling shots to make it more suspenseful. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, it was the least expensive movie ever to be produced. $37.40, about $1,340 today. It was a 7-minute film. It was so successful that the negative wore out and the film had to be made over again. Sherlock Holmes is back. Sherlock Holmes. A Study in Scarlet, 1877, was the first in the series of Sherlock Holmes books by Arthur Conan Doyle. The fictional detective Sherlock Holmes was highly lucrative for Conan Doyle, but the author, he really wanted to be an author. He wanted to be, I don't know, one of the great authors of all time. This was schlock for him. He didn't like it at all. Even though it made him money, it was schlock. But the author decided to kill him off once he had earned enough money, sending him over a Swiss waterfall in 1893. Conan Doyle worried that the work was too commercial for him to be considered a serious author. Hey, let me tell you something. If they're going to pay me, and I have to put out schlock, I will put out schlock as long as the money is coming in. And 90% of the people in my business, journalism, writing, would say the same thing. But Holmes returned because his publisher, his family, and even the people, everyday people, wanted Holmes to return, and the author listened to his fans, and then probably his accountant said, hey, listen, Arthur, come here. You know how much money you can make with that? And you know how much money you're paying me? Well, if I could do the books more, I could make more money off of you. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a 9-minute silent movie produced by the Vitagraph Company, was released on September 6th. Another movie, Sherlock Holmes, or Held for Ransom, was released on October 7th. Viva Las Vegas! Las Vegas really doesn't exist before 1905. On May 15th, Las Vegas officially was founded as a city when 110 acres were auctioned to buyers. The land was sold to establish a railroad stop between Los Angeles, California and Salt Lake City, Utah. The completion of the San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad made Las Vegas a refueling and rest stop. The availability of water in Las Vegas made it an ideal refueling point and a rest stop. Well, what's the legacy? The Niagara movement would be doomed to failure. But out of the failure comes the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Activists were fed up after the Springfield, Illinois race riot in 1908 and decided to act. Less than a month prior to William Howard Taft's inaugural, on February 12, 1909, the date of Abraham Lincoln's 100th birthday, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was established in New York by an interracial group of activists. These are child laborers. The federal child labor provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 were enacted to ensure that when young people work, the work is safe and does not jeopardize their health, well-being, or educational opportunities. 2024, at least 16 states had one or more bills that elected officials were considering that would weaken child labor laws, and at least 13 states were seeking to strengthen them. Indiana repealed all work hour restrictions for 16 and 17-year-olds who previously could not work past 10 p.m. or before 6 a.m. on school days. The law also extended legal working hours for 14 and 15-year-olds. Russia. Here I am in Russia, St. Petersburg. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his work in ending the Russo-Japanese War. In Russia, Nicholas II would be overthrown in 1917. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks would be part of two revolutions that year. Lenin would ultimately prevail. The Soviet Union collapsed on December 26, 1991. However, there are still some problems between Japan and Russia that have not been resolved over the 120 years. Japanese relations with Russia actually did improve after the treaty, as the United States and Japan's relationship worsened. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and America entered World War II. The Americans and Russians were allies. Soviet Union and Japan never signed a peace treaty. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Russia decided to do something about the Kuril Islands dispute, known as the Northern Territories dispute in Japan. Japan has claimed that the Soviet Union, now Russia, illegally seized 4 islands after it surrendered to Americans on September 2nd, 1945. In March 2022, the Russian military started a military exercise involving more than 3,000 troops on the chain of islands. Neither side has signed the peace treaty because of the dispute, so it's ongoing. Me on the right there in the blue shirt, my friend Bruce Morton on the left. We all had hair in those days, and Joe Namath in the middle there, talking about the Jets' 1969 Super Bowl victory over the Baltimore Colts. Football in 1905, nobody could imagine what it would become today. The college presidents came up with a plan to make it safer. The National Football League is the king of professional sports in the United States, and college football has a substantial following. According to self-proclaimed experts, Jerry Jones' Dallas Cowboys franchise could be worth as much as $11 billion, and the lowest valued franchise, the Cincinnati Bengals, worth more than $5 million. Of course, a franchise is worth what someone is willing to pay for it. Players are still dying annually on the field from football-related activities, and head injuries remain a problem for the industry. That's John J. McGraw, the 1905 World Series, a picture taken in Philadelphia. The manager, McGraw, and the Giants franchise owner, Charles Stoner, co-owned a racetrack and a casino in Cuba. McGraw's business interests also included a Manhattan pool room, I gotta explain something about pool room. In New York City, you are not allowed to call a pool room a pool room. It's a billiards hall. It comes out of the Prohibition in the early 1920s. They thought pool hall wasn't classy enough. It had to be a billiards hall. Anyway, they included the Manhattan Pool Hall. And that he co-owned with Arnold Rothstein. You know who Arnold Rothstein is? He put organized in organized crime. Rothstein denied having any role in the fixing of the 1919 World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. 8 White Sox players were banned from baseball. Rothstein allegedly earned around $350,000 from betting, $6.4 million today, on the Cincinnati Reds. In 1989, Cincinnati Reds manager Pete Rose was tossed from baseball for doing what McGraw did, bet on his team. In 2024, Tucupita Borcano was banned from baseball for life for betting on baseball. Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 4 novels and 56 short stories about the mastermind's pursuit of criminals by using his observational skills and power of deduction. Sherlock Holmes stories have appeared and have been adapted for stage, film, television. Benedict Cumberbatch, Peter Cushing, Roger Moore, Ian McKellen, Michael Caine, Charlton Heston, and Jonathan Pryce have played Sherlock Holmes. Basil Rathbone did it 14 times in the movies. His popularity also extended to video games. That is Las Vegas, and that's where we leave it. Las Vegas was the driving force in the creation of Clark County in Nevada in 1909. It was incorporated in 1911 as part of the county. Nevada decided to legalize gambling in 1931, but only in certain areas under strict conditions. That was the turning point in Las Vegas history, and it would begin its ascension to earn the title of the gambling capital of the world. The 1930s, a booming time for Las Vegas. More and more hotels and casinos were being built, and the city began to establish itself as the destination for entertainment and gambling. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn. Your turn to talk.